Be live any minute. I will let you know. All right, I think that is it. So, welcome everyone to the Turanga Weekly Program. Turanga Ranch does urban wildlife education. I think that is it. In Los Angeles and surrounding areas, we like to get people excited about the wildlife that shares their backyards and communities. And also help people keep their pets safe. And I'm Dana Stengel. Tonight, we are here with someone else who does wildlife education through his photos. Stephen David Johnson is a conservation photographer and professor of visual communication arts at EMU in the Shenandoah Valley. His photography of the natural world has appeared in Orion, Nature Conservancy Magazine, Ranger Rick, Virginia Wildlife, National Science Teachers Association Press books, and numerous conservation publications and journals. Steve is vice president of the Virginia Wilderness Committee and an affiliate of the International League of Conservation Photographers. When he's not in the office, you'll probably find him crouched next to a vernal pool, photographing Appalachian salamanders. Welcome, Steve.
Thank you.
While most wildlife photographers are out searching for the large, charismatic megafauna, Stephen David Johnson is drawn the opposite way. He finds drama in the microcosm. Can you tell us about the vernal pools of Appalachia?
Yeah, absolutely. So I moved to Virginia from New York in 2005. And I had been photographing the natural world, but I wanted to get this understanding of this new place that I was in. And pretty quickly, I started to realize through hanging out with scientists, working with nonprofits, that the big conservation story, the big biodiversity story in this area has to do with salamander diversity. So I became really fascinated by this. We have all these endemic species, salamanders that live on one mountain range and nowhere else in the world. And as I started to get more aware of salamander species, I also realized that a big part of the life story for many of them involved water. So I went on this trip, this field trip that was sponsored by a local organization, and it was all about learning about vernal pools. So if you don't know what vernal pools are, they are ephemeral ponds. They fill up typically in the spring from rain or snow melt, and for a little while, they host these breeding events for different types of amphibians, salamanders and some frog species, some macro invertebrates. So I became really interested in documenting what was happening in this little tiny aquatic world. And that involved a lot of technical work, figuring out the underwater lighting aspect of it, and a lot of learning. Just hanging out with scientists, picking their brains, reading lots of books, trying to understand the behavior and life cycles. So this is what one of those pools looks like standing right above it. And they vary throughout the year in their water level. So certain times of the year, they may dry up completely. And that's actually important for vernal pools because that drying process means they don't get established fish populations. And that's what allows salamanders to breed in them safely. They're also really beautiful. Some of these pools are really pristine. They're really small ones. Sometimes as a photographer, I can stretch my body across one. That's how small they are, just kind of a glorified puddle in the forest. Other times, they're a few acres. This is a fairly large one. It's a sinkhole pond about an hour away from me. A really beautiful, unique natural area. These are some of the creatures that I find. So the two salamander species that you see here live in the east. The one at the bottom is called a spotted salamander. The one on the top left is called a marbled salamander. And of course, we've got a frog species here. This is a spring peeper. And that's a really ubiquitous call across the eastern United States, that peeping sound. The particular technique that I'm using here, a group of photographers pioneered this. It's called Meet Your Neighbors style photography. You may have run into it before, and it's photographing against this white background. It's a sheet of acrylite, sheet of plastic that's backlit with a flash. And this technique allows you to string together a number of images and then show the biodiversity of a particular area, concentrating on the details of the particular species, maybe not so much in this case, looking at the environment. But of course, the environment really fascinates me too. So this is another example of a vernal pool, and you see some of the trees reflected in it. What you're seeing here in the foreground are spotted salamander egg masses. And as far as the natural history goes, you'll notice that they look pretty different in their appearance. Some of them are kind of clear with this bluish tint. The others are cloudy, kind of look like clouds in the sky, but they're from the same species. And it's not completely understood why some spotted salamanders lay cloudy eggs and why others lay these clear eggs. There's some theories about this. But of course, as a photographer, those clear eggs that have that tinge of blue are so beautiful when they're lit up in the sun. Here's a close-up of a spotted salamander mother laying her eggs. This was actually from my sabbatical project. So one of the really nice things about being a university professor is I can apply for a sabbatical every 7 years to do a research project and get more into depth in the type of work that I'm doing. This is important because I have a heavy teaching load, and the type of stuff that happens often happens at night, often when it's cold, and there's a limited amount of time that I can get out and look for these things night after night when I'm teaching the next day. So to have a semester where I could concentrate on just following the life cycles and go out night after night, I finally was able to get this image of a spotted salamander just at the moment where she is laying her egg mass. And that was incredibly exciting to me.
You're sitting there getting that picture. This is not just a camera that you put somewhere. I don't even know if they do that. Do they put cameras underwater that are like, well, no, they couldn't be motion sensing, right?
It's something I'd love to try someday. I've done some time-lapse photography underwater, but no, I was there. I saw
That's incredible. Oh my gosh.
My wife was actually out with me on this particular night, and she could attest to how incredibly excited I was after I made this photo. I'll say, as a photographer, I know this is more of a natural history audience, but I knew if I got this, I would probably only have 1 or 2 frames to make the image work.
Right.
So I practice a lot before I go out. I actually use Star Wars figures. I set them up in my studio and I practice lighting setups. So when I go out in the field and I see this thing that I know I need to photograph in a split second, I've got the lighting down, and kind of paid off that night.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they're just such interesting creatures. So I actually have a sequence here of
cool.
spotted salamander egg laying, and then kind of what happens next. So this is what those eggs then look like in context. This is in one of my favorite vernal pools. Some pools actually end up becoming really lush. So underwater, they're like this little verdant jungle, and the eggs are nestled inside of the foliage. This is a little bit later in the process, and you can see at this point, the eggs are starting to develop. Again, kind of nestled within the moss. This is a split view, so you can see the season outside here. It's pretty early in the spring, so there's not a lot of foliage outside of the pond, but in the pond, there's quite a bit.
That's a great photo.
So I love behavior and interactions too. At first you might notice the one wood frog tadpole here, but if you stare a little longer, you'll see there's wood frog tadpoles all around the periphery of this image. And there are lots of things that will start to nibble at the edges of these spotted salamander egg masses over time.
Wow.
So I know when we were having some discussion, Dana, you mentioned that you felt like some of my images had a kind of painterly influence.
Absolutely. I look at them and they look like paintings that like, I have to look again and be like, is that a photo? Like they're amazing.
Yeah, and that's pretty intentional on my part. So some of my background, I was an art major in college. I studied, in addition to traditional photography, which was mostly darkroom at that point, I was studying drawing, painting, art history. So when I'm thinking about the kind of aesthetic that I want to use to represent my images to the world, I think a lot about the kind of iconic paintings that mattered to me as an undergraduate student. In particular, kind of touchstone for me was Jan Vermeer, Dutch painter. And when I made this image on the right, I thought, when I was looking at it, that lighting, I know it reminds me of a particular painting. And so I went back and did a little searching, and sure enough, it had this sort of color treatment and light that was influenced by this experience I had as a young person in college.
That's awesome. That is really incredible.
Part of the reason I know, part of what you're interested in doing is getting people interested in science and the natural world. I often tell my students as a university professor that if you can draw on iconic language that's part of our cultural history, that can be really powerful in terms of communication. Might not be that you identify a particular painting, but it's part of a cultural legacy that may still in your subconscious communicate.
Yeah.
So a few more from that spotted salamander life cycle. I just find it so intriguing that as these creatures start to develop, they're still within these little egg cases. It's so jewel-like, so fascinating to me. They start to develop gills.
The amount of detail
I'm actually working
is incredible inside those eggs. It's really mind-blowing.
Yeah, and there are illustrated diagrams that you can find of the natural history of this. I mean, basically every day of development is labeled with its own stage. So you can identify it almost down to the day, how long these eggs have been developing and where they start to transform and grow certain features. This was another image that was exciting to me. Now, I'll say that it kind of looks like it's just bursting out of the egg, although it was actually kind of hovering there for a while as it was about to leave its egg case. So I had a little bit of time to get in there and photograph that moment. It was really exciting to see the culmination.
Now, how big is this to the naked eye? Like if I'm out there, like how, I mean, I could see definitely those, when you showed us that picture from further away of the different egg groups together, right? But like if you had to compare a single one of these eggs to something that I would know, like what would you compare it to?
Oh, I would say, it's probably maybe a centimeter or so.
Okay.
Yeah. So very, very small. So I'm using a series of macro lenses for these, sometimes a traditional macro lens, sometimes an ultra macro lens to get even closer.
Okay.
One interesting thing about the natural history of this, you'll notice as the eggs progress from the left to the right that they get increasingly green. And that's because spotted salamanders have this sort of symbiotic relationship with a type of algae. There's a researcher named Ryan Kearney who's done this amazing work on this in recent years. And he's discovered that not only does this algae get inside of the eggs, it's actually infusing the individual cells of these salamander embryos. The first time this has ever been found in a vertebrate species, and seems to be conveying some sort of benefit to the salamander. I find that so fascinating.
That's awesome.
Now, beyond spotted salamanders, there's lots of other vernal pool creatures. This is a type of salamander where there's a species that lives in the West, in California, tiger salamander. This happens to be an eastern tiger salamander. In Virginia, where I live, they're a state endangered species. And this particular group is actually a relictual population from the Pleistocene. So they've been there for thousands and thousands of years, cut off from the rest of the tiger salamander population, this little Appalachian region. This is actually a fairly common type of eastern species. These are red-spotted newts. And in this case, you're seeing them feeding on spotted salamander eggs. This was actually something from my sabbatical project too. I had never seen a huge group like this, almost like a shark feeding frenzy, coming in and eating these eggs. It was amazing to watch.
Wow. I feel like I don't have much to say. Usually I would do these interviews and I have all these comments and all these questions, but these photos, I could just sit and look at all of the different details and aspects of them for, oh gosh. And of course this one.
Yeah, so this is newt courtship behavior. So they do this kind of headlock thing when they're getting ready to breed. This was fun because a lot of my imagery is at night and requires flashes, but newts, and I know there's newt species in California too, they often have toxins in their skin. And so predators don't bother them. And that means they're often out during the day. So I was able to photograph this in natural light, which is really fun. It gives it a different sort of sensibility. It's also just nice to be able to observe things in the daytime sometimes.
Yeah, you can see so much more. That's amazing.
Yeah, so they are voracious predators too, often feeding on various types of water beetles.
That's also a great photo.
Yeah, I'll actually mention this one is a little bit different than the others. This is actually a still image that I pulled from a 4K video that I made. So that's another way of doing documentation, and it allows you to go back and pull the perfect frame out from a longer series of documentation. This is a same sort of species, but in its larval stage with these great gills growing around its neck.
Yeah, that is a magnificent display.
So you never know, and I love the surprises of going out and seeing something new. So this was a night scene. I was out in the middle of a vernal pool. It was pitch black, and I was wandering around in my waders. And of course, I'm very careful. I move very slowly and deliberately when I actually need to enter a vernal pool because they're fragile. So I'm looking around with my flashlight, making sure I don't step on anything. And I came across this scene. This is a woodfrog. And it was just resting on this, what looks like a cloud. It's another spotted salamander egg mass. But it seemed to be resting or asleep and just kind of curled up on the top. It was such an amazing scene to witness.
It must be soft like a pillow.
Yeah, exactly. Now, this is actually moving a little bit away from the vernal pools, although you'll sometimes find American toads in vernal pools. This is actually at a riverside. So I'm also interested in riverine creatures. I do a lot of freshwater, shallow water photography of all sorts of creatures related to rivers, ponds, etc. So this is another one during breeding season. You can see that male in the background is like a little backpack compared to this giant female toad. And we're getting ready to breed. She'll lay this string of spaghetti-like eggs. So I know one of the things you had asked me, Dana, is what's one of the smallest creatures I've ever photographed?
Yes.
This might fit the bill. So what you're seeing in the background here is a woodfrog egg. And that woodfrog egg is maybe half a centimeter tall, 4 or 5 millimeters. And these creatures that are in front of that egg are called seed shrimp. They're a tiny, tiny kind of crustacean, maybe 1.5 millimeters long. When you see them with your naked eye, I'm often perched at the edge of a pool trying to see what's happening.
Yeah.
They just look like dots. They're the size of a pinhead. And you just see them kind of moving through the water. I didn't really know what they were until I got in with an ultra macro lens. And so I was photographing it about 3.5 times life size. And then, through that viewfinder, I was able to actually see their structure. And they are such fascinating things. They have these translucent shells. They have these little feelers that come out. They're bivalves. They open up slightly like clams. So that's probably one of the smallest things that I've been able to document.
That's incredible. You just don't really expect to see so many things that are just clear and just screaming out, photograph me, right? Like for you,
Yeah.
they're everywhere. I wish we had as much water here in Southern California as you have there, because this is just so incredible.
It is really lush. And I have done some vernal pool work in the West, in Oregon. There's some amazing vernal pools there too.
Sounds like I need to take a road trip.
Yeah. Yeah. The Southern Appalachians are really amazing in terms of their biodiversity and water features.
Yeah.
This would also qualify as some of the smallest creatures that I've photographed. Just for context, I'm going to go back a few images. So when we go back to this image, one of the things you might not have noticed, you'll see these little flecks of orange-red in the background.
Yeah.
Okay. So kind of keep that in your mind. And now if you look at the top left, that's one of those orange flecks. This is called a copepod. And this was another example of something I had often witnessed swimming around, but they were too small for me to really understand. So for part of my sabbatical project, I bought this ultra macro setup and started focusing on some of the very tiniest creatures that inhabit vernal pools. And that opened up an entirely new world to me. So copepods are these tiny crustaceans. They've got long antennae like this. They have one eye in the middle. You'll find salamander preying on them. Lots of things eat them, but they have this amazing little structure to themselves.
Just incredible.
And these are called daphne, which you see on the right-hand side.
It's called what?
They've got one eye in the middle and these branching antennae. This was super challenging. The type of setup I used to document these is a fixed focus lens. And then I'm trying to focus on something that's moving through a three-dimensional space and is 2 or 3 millimeters long. Right. So my first try at this, I probably was able to get 1 image out of every 50 I tried. The rest were just blurs of nothing. But over time, you start to get a sense of the behavior of these creatures, and peeper rate gets to be a little bit higher.
Wow. Yeah, I can't imagine what that depth perception must be like on the camera, trying to decide where to focus while everything's moving.
This is a fairy shrimp. These are in the West too. They start off fairly small, but there are some fairy shrimp that can get fairly sizable, more than 1 inch. So I'm not huge, but much bigger than some of the crustaceans that I've shown you before. This is a male, has these sort of unique claspers that it uses during mating.
Interesting.
Yeah. These are indicator species for vernal pools, so they require vernal pools for their breeding and life cycle. Dana, I know another question you asked me is, if you were interested in documenting this sort of natural history, can you do it without spending thousands of dollars?
Yes.
And the answer is yeah. Now, just for reference, I'll show you, this is the kind of setup that I use for most of my work.
Wow.
And this is at least a few $1,000s just for the housing and the underwater strobes. I mean, altogether, it's probably $4,000 or $5,000 to put this together. So it took me a while to save up from my projects and figure out how to get this type of system for my work. And I do license a number of my photographs, and that helps pay for the type of conservation photo work I do. But there are ways of doing this less expensively and that work great in certain situations. So this is an image I made with an Olympus compact camera that's waterproof from the get-go. So $300 or $400, you can buy one of these compact cameras. I think the latest model is a TG6. And this allows you to do some incredible macro work underwater or on land. I think it's a great naturalist tool. And I know a lot of scientists will have one of these in their pocket when they go out so that they can document different creatures.
That's good to know.
Yeah. Now, if you want to go even cheaper, pull this out of my pocket, a phone. I have a $15 underwater case on my phone. And it's not going to get me super macro stuff, although there are attachments you can put on for doing underwater super macro with your phone. But this is just an iPhone SE. So with the case on it, I've been able to do some great underwater documentation, particularly video.
Really? That's now yeah. I gotta try that.
Yeah. So, if anybody's interested in knowing, exactly the model, the tech stuff, I'm glad to take questions about that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, we don't have any questions so far, but anybody that has a question, they should feel free to put it in the chat. Oh my goodness!
Is with that camera.
I love him.
This time a terrestrial creature. When I was out documenting vernal pools, this landed on my finger. So I photographed it using that super macro mode. I'll close out the vernal pool section with just a couple more images. In addition to salamanders and frogs, I'm interested in invertebrates. This is a caddisfly larva, usually an indicator of really good water quality. And like many things that you've seen, they love to prey on salamander eggs. I just found this creature to be so alien. Caddisfly larvae create little homes for themselves out of whatever's around. Different species will knit together leaves like you're seeing here. Others will take sticks and build little log cabins that they live in. And then they drag these around with them and kind of poke the front part of their body out as they're preying on things.
That's incredible.
Yeah, I was really excited when I saw this. This was at a pretty small vernal pool, and I was able to just kind of stretch my body over the rocks without actually getting in the pool, and fired off a few images with underwater strobes, and I was really happy that I was able to document this interaction because I think it's so fascinating.
Yeah, you go in to get pictures of the eggs, and instead you're finding all these cool things that prey on the eggs. I mean, the eggs are cool too, don't get me wrong, but that's just awesome.
You know, and so many of the animals that breed in these pools are explosive breeders. You know, their strategy is to make lots and lots of babies, and just a very few will actually survive.
Right. Yeah, and they're food for so many other things to survive all the way up the food chain.
Mm-hmm. Another fierce predator in a vernal pool. This is a dragonfly larva.
Ooh. That lighting is amazing.
Yeah, this was another one that I believe was natural light.
It's like he's got a little spotlight on him.
Yeah. Dan, I can stop there if you want to take any questions, or you want to ask me more questions before getting into another topic.
Sure. Oh my goodness. Well, I have so many questions. You know, I wanted to ask you, especially now, this is a great reminder. It says conservation photography. I only recently learned that there's a difference between conservation photography and regular old wildlife photography. Can you explain to us what that means to you, and what it means in general, and what some people do and what some people don't do, and why you're a conservation photographer?
Yeah. There's a group, the International League of Conservation Photographers, where when they explain this to people, they'll often say it's nature photography with a mission. And I think what they mean by that is it's nature photography or wildlife photography that's used with a purpose, usually for some sort of advocacy. So the type of advocacy work that I do is often partnering with various conservation nonprofits to protect wildlands, to protect particular species, to protect wildlife corridors, etc. So that happens for me in different ways. Sometimes I have a pet project that I'm simply fascinated by. And as I'm working on that project and learning the natural history, I'll also start to understand what the conservation issues are, because there's hardly a species you can work on these days that doesn't have a conservation issue attached to it. So then I'll use those images and maybe construct stories about those conservation issues, maybe pitch them to a magazine. But it often happens the other way too, that I might get an assignment from a nonprofit or a magazine to do a story about a particular issue. In that case, I might go in the field and work on that kind of documentation.
Interesting. And I actually have another question. This is sort of about the evolution of your photography. Like, where did this all start for you? I know you said that the project regarding the vernal pools came when you moved to the area, but my guess is you were involved in photography well before that.
Yeah. So I've been involved in photography since high school, working in the high school yearbook. Then, of course, I was an art major in college. All through that time, I was interested in the natural world. I grew up in a rural area, spent a lot of time in the woods. And so when I took my university job, I was continuing to do that sort of work, But I don't think I really started to make this conscious switch to really thinking about conservation till maybe about 10 years ago. And I think as I was doing more natural history work, I just became so aware of the issues that were affecting the natural history of my region. And I can show you some examples of that. As an aside, I'll mention that I also teach a course in this at EMU. So I take students out in the field. I love exposing them to the forest around here, to the techniques that we use. A few of them might go on and continue. I've had a student who did an internship for the Smithsonian, now does all this amazing work documenting wood turtles, doing radio telemetry with them and putting his photographic skills to work. But for other students, it will be an avocation, something that they'll add to their life experience. And I'm glad for that too.
That's awesome.
So this is where I live.
Class.
This is across the street from me on the North Fork of the Shenandoah River in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. So when I moved to Virginia in 2005, this is kind of the area that I was exploring. It's beautiful, but I've also described it to people as kind of a wounded area. What you don't see here is there's a lot of runoff into the river from agriculture, from roads, from development. So over the years, we've had fish kills in the river. That was one of the first things that started to open my eyes to the conservation issues that were in the Appalachian region. These are some of my neighbors.
Wow. Is that a snake?
Before getting to the Vernal
Eating
Pool
a
project, yeah, that was such a great experience. I was actually out in a kayak with my daughter and just saw this flash on the shore, and I paddled over, and this is the scene that I saw: this northern water snake devouring a channel catfish. It's amazing to see that, like, the tiny scale of its mouth taking on this huge fish.
Yeah.
And a mink and a common snapping turtle.
The snapping turtle looks like a comic. It doesn't even look real. That is such a great picture.
Oh, thanks. He was kind of coming towards me, and I, after I made that photo, I backed off a bit.
Yeah.
Because they can back a wall if.
You like your nose.
Yeah. Exactly.
So, what else was I going to ask you? I was going to ask you actually if the pandemic has affected your photography at all.
Absolutely. Yeah, let me go down to a few other images. I'll just mention this is one of those fish I was mentioning. It's not looking that great.
Oh, wow.
You know, and that was kind of a wake-up call for me.
Yeah.
So I could do two things at this. I can jump ahead and talk about some of my pandemic work, or if you want me to show a few more images related to the conservation work, I do.
Oh, show us more images about the conservation work. Yeah, no, I don't mean to cut you off at all.
So these are some other regional projects that have been really important to me. So I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that I do a lot of work with endemic salamanders. This is one of them. A cow-knob salamander lives on this couple of ridges and nowhere else in the world. And this was another example where I went out with a group of naturalists. There was somebody at another university who specializes in studying cow-knob salamanders, and that was my introduction to these creatures. And I started photographing them. Pretty soon, I found out they were connected to a huge conservation issue, and that was an industrial scale pipeline called the Atlantic Coast Pipeline that was being proposed to be built through parts of West Virginia, and all the way through North Carolina. And that started about a 6-year process where I joined up with a regional coalition of groups that were fighting this pipeline, because it was it was going to have such an impact on our forest and also on private land, including much farmland. So how does the countdown salamander fit in this? Well, the original pipeline route was going to go right next to their territory. And there's an agreement in Virginia to try to protect their territory. So part of my job was to go out with my students and try to document the actual locations of where these salamanders were at. And that was part of a multi-pronged effort that involved scientists and other folks, but we were glad to play our part in actually showing what these creatures look like. And also, as a visual communicator, one of the things I think about a lot is how can something that's very small, slimy, lives on the forest floor, how can it connect with people? And so often what I'll do is I'll get down at eye level with those creatures and get really close so that I can make an image as if I was another creature looking at them right in the eye. I feel like that's a way that people can comprehend what they are and what they're about, rather than simply a general guidebook image that's often taken from overhead, as if you're a giant looking down at this tiny thing. And I'm happy to say the pipeline is no more.
Yay!
Yeah. This was an article I helped to illustrate with my photography for Biographic, which is actually out of California Academy of Sciences. This was just last year. I went and interviewed people. I documented what the pipeline was starting to look like because they were already starting to put parts of it in the ground in West Virginia. And then earlier this year, we got the great news that the whole project was being shut down. And that was a huge years-long effort from a whole umbrella of environmental conservation organizations and community activists. So good news.
Yeah, and I think it's just a reminder, maybe a reminder that we need today, that indeed a small group of concerned community members can make a great big difference.
Yeah, and one of the things that was actually interesting about this in our incredibly polarized time is that this ran across the political spectrum, and it involved people coming together from really different perspectives. So you had, environmentalists thinking about salamanders and forests, and you had farmers who were interested in property rights. And you got all these people in a room talking to each other, and that was super powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, I bet it was. And your images had to be so helpful. I think they really do. You explained it so perfectly, and that's really what it is, which hadn't really occurred to me. I don't find myself particularly interested in salamanders, but I'm interested in the ones that you take pictures of. I feel like you've opened up a whole other world to a lot of people.
Well, and what was nice too is, some of the people in that coalition wouldn't have been interested in salamanders either, but they started to pay attention when it mattered to the whole debate about whether this pipeline was going to go through their property. And I think that kind of attention might continue. And of course, environmentalists learned so much about the private property aspects of that too, and what it all meant, how it was all connected. This is one other creature that was also related to that pipeline battle.
Oh, wow.
Another incredible conservation photographer is Clay Bolt, who you may know, Dana. He did this project to raise awareness about native bumblebees. And one of the projects he put together was called Ghost in the Making, a collaboration with some filmmakers about the plight of the rusty patch bumblebee. It used to be a really common species, is no longer, but it was another creature that was in the path of the pipeline. And partly through Clay's advocacy and the work of many people, it was listed as an endangered species, the first bumblebee species in lower 48 states to be listed that way. So this is an example of one. It's actually not a great photo. And I put this in here on purpose because sometimes that kind of conservation advocacy doesn't depend on a fantastic image. It just depends on the documentation. So I went all day looking for these with a private landowner. And I thought I had bombed out. At the end of the day, I took my card off. I was looking through and I saw this butterfly. And then I thought, wait, what? What is that? And right underneath the butterfly was the species I had been looking for. And I was able to send that to the agencies. They did some more surveys, found a whole bunch more of them. And that actually became an important part of the legal battle, was knowing these rusty patch bumblebees were there. Again, a group effort, but I was glad to play a small role.
Wow. It's a great story.
Okay, so then you've asked about what am I doing in COVID time?
I love these.
So this is a spice bush swallowtail caterpillar. I had never seen one before. I kind of know where to look now, but in the COVID era, I, like many people, have had to stay home more. And so I started really turning my attention to things in my backyard, just trying to do deep observation. One day I was out in my backyard and I saw this kind of curled up leaf, and I peered into it, and this was what was staring back at me. And I didn't know what it was. At first I thought it was a weird salamander, but it didn't look like any salamander I'd ever seen. And then I got a better look and realized, oh, those are false eyes. And I'm actually looking at a caterpillar. So spice bush swallowtail caterpillars have this amazing defense mechanism where they kind of look like an amphibian. And if you move up a little close to them, they will shoot out these sort of horns that look like a snake tongue. So different people have described them as mimicking snakes, mimicking frogs. There's some different theories about that, but fascinating creature.
That is awesome. Oh my, that is, oh my gosh, a face only a mother could love.
And those eye spots are so convincing, and they're actually three-dimensional.
Wow.
There's one really cool.
Yeah.
I had seen things like this in the tropics, but this is the first time I'd ever seen one in my backyard. So continuing on with the backyard series, I noticed this one day. I was looking near our pond, and it looked like it was a dead flower, and then it started to move. And here's a close-up of it. This is a type of caterpillar called a camouflaged looper. And what it's doing here, it's plucking out the petals from the flower. You can see it, it's little feelers here. It's plucking them out, and then it's turning. You can see one right there. And then it stuck it on its back. And it does this all day long to camouflage itself. So it just looks like this dead flower until you see it move.
Oh my goodness, that's amazing.
And there have been so many things like this over the last few months that have been in my yard probably all along. I just never saw them. Sometimes I talk to my students about getting their eyes on. Like, you get your eyes on for a particular scale or a particular kind of behavior, and then you just start seeing it over and over again.
That's right. We were just talking about that with tracking last week or the week before. We were talking about tracking, and we were talking about once you start to see something, then you keep seeing it, right? And that just seems to be a common thread with all the people that I know of that are, that make wildlife part of their lives.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, as a photographer, I find when I put a particular lens on, I start to see through that lens. Like, I'll show you, this is my ultra macro lens. And, I focus about this close with it. And it goes from about 2.5 times life size to 5 times life size. So when I have that lens on, I start looking for things that are going to be in that range. Yeah. And here's one of the things I found. This is a sawfly larva. It has, this amazing complex little eye. And this is it perched on a piece of grass. So that gives you the sense of the scale. It's a tiny little thing.
I love this one. This is one of my favorites also. Just incredible. The detail is just, it's crazy. And I love this one too. Oh my goodness. What is she doing? Tell me about this, because I've seen ants and I've seen aphids, but I've never seen an ant managing her aphids.
Yeah, that's what's going on. I mean, she's farming. So, with her antenna, she'll kind of stimulate the aphids. They'll release their little drop of honeydew, and then the ants gobble it up. So they get this benefit of a nutrient, and the aphids get the benefit of the ants' protection. So it's this really interesting kind of relationship.
What a story. And the color, what are they on?
They're on a rose.
So
this is, this is like 15 feet from where I am, rose bush right in our backyard.
And everyone has ants and everyone has aphids. We're all going to take this picture tomorrow.
Yeah, this is very, very small. This ant is, a few millimeters long.
Oh my goodness.
So this is some of my latest work. A few of these you've seen. One of my favorite things, jumping spiders. They're so charismatic, and there are so many species. It's another example of kind of getting my eyes on. So this is my daughter, my youngest daughter, and she's looking up into this flower in front of our house, and she's looking at a jumping spider. You can't really see it here, but this is what she was looking at. This is actually a baby, Hensia matrata, long-jawed jumping spider. I love those scales near its eyes that kind of look like eyelashes.
Yeah, that's really
again,
cute.
A couple millimeters long. And once I got my eyes on, I realized, oh, okay, they hang out in flowers all the time, waiting to ambush the bugs that go in the flowers. It used to be that every so often I'd see a jumping spider. Sort of felt random. I never knew when I was going to see one, and it might only be a couple times a year.
Yeah.
Now I can go out at any time of the day, and I can usually round one up in, a few minutes, because I know where they're going to be.
I love that. You really take coexisting with the backyard wildlife to a new level. I'm all worried about raccoons and coyotes, but you are down to jumping spiders. Like, this is amazing. Now I'm going to be looking at my flowers.
I mentioned Clay Bolt's work with the bumblebees, and it wasn't very long ago that native bumblebees were super common. You wouldn't have even thought about them in conservation terms. And suddenly it's a crisis. Yeah. So when I'm photographing common species, I often think about it in those terms, that I'm documenting baseline stuff. Yeah. And so many things are suffering. Monarch butterflies, the insects in general are in a world of trouble.
Yeah.
This is a juvenile bold jumping spider. They make a little silken hammock that they live in. And this is it peeking out from its hammock right outside of our door.
Oh my goodness, that's cute. I really didn't think I would think of spiders as cute before, but these are just adorable.
They are so charismatic. This is another one on an individual petal.
Oh, gosh.
I think it looks like it has night vision goggles on.
It does. It's like a little steampunk jumping spider.
Now you mentioned coexistence. We have jumping spiders that coexist in our house too. My sister is not very impressed by this fact that we let them stay there, but they don't bother me, and I love seeing them.
I've got a resident widow. It's okay. I understand.
So this is what this one looks like up close.
That's beautiful. Just beautiful.
They're kind of like
Those
real life
colors.
Muppets.
Yeah. I love the little hairs sticking up too. Yeah, like on the one they looked like eyelashes, but on this one they sort of look like an old man.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and their jaws, are often iridescent like this, which is fascinating too. This is a composite image that I put together from 2 images and combined in Photoshop, just because I think it's hard sometimes to appreciate the scale. So this is in millimeters. So you can kind of see, from tip of the leg to tip of the leg, it's 4 millimeters wide.
That's great. That's exactly the kind of connections people need, because they can't, it's hard to imagine when you see these close-ups. It's like, well, wait a minute, how big is that really?
These are the last 2 images. This is just from this past week. This jumping spider was hanging out on our kitchen table and looking at a bowl of fruit that we had on our kitchen table. And when I blew up the photo a little bit, I noticed you could see the bowl of fruit reflected in its eyes. And
he's like a harvest
really
spider. He's all brown and orange with a fruit bowl in his eyes. That's really awesome.
This is the same one, same spider, actually on one of our apples.
Oh, that's great.
So, Dame, that's it for images. I'm glad to go back to any images, to answer questions, whatever makes sense for you.
Oh my goodness. Well, I just can't thank you enough for sharing all this with us. This has just been so much fun. If anyone has any questions, you can feel free to put them in the chat. So far, we still don't have any. But yeah, these are amazing. I want to also say thank you for staying up late. It is so late there. It's 8 o'clock here. It's getting to be 11 o'clock there. So if we don't have any questions, I think, just checking my list, I feel like we've gotten through a lot of the questions, and hopefully more of your fans there on the East Coast will be able to check this recording out tomorrow. So, and anybody that's here, if you enjoyed this interview tonight, you should definitely give it the thumbs up. That'll be great for everyone. And if you like this kind of stuff, you should subscribe, because we're doing this stuff all the time and other stuff too. And next week, we're going to be also talking with photographers. This time it's going to be a panel. This one is called Camera Trap, and it's featuring,
oh, nice.
Yeah, Denis Calais, Paul Faustich, and Janet Pesaturo. So I am excited to be interviewing them next week. Yeah, I just can't say how much fun I'm having getting to know people and learning more about the ways they contribute to this great bigger picture, that we're all, trying to fight for the planet and all of its crazy little inhabitants. So again, I just want to say, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This has been so much fun. So I'm going to end the stream right now. Is there anything else you want to say before we're done? Any parting message?
I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We're going to end it here. So I'm going to, I got to check the stream here. All right. So there, the stream has ended.